Hello everyone! So for this video, we are going to be talking about multiculturalism. We will begin with introductory concepts and then we'll talk about intercultural relations and then we will get into multiculturalism as a socio-political concept. So if you remember, in our very first lecture, we talked about the introductory concepts on culture. And now we will just talk about a little more advanced concepts so that we will be able to understand multiculturalism as a way of life, as a standard of living in certain societies. So the first concept that we are going to be talking about is cultural universals. So cultural universals are anything common that exists in every human culture on the planet, yet varies from different culture to culture, such as values and modes of behavior. Examples of elements that may be considered cultural universals are gender roles. So all cultures have a concept of gender and has the way of segregating and organizing society based on gender roles and functions. And of course, in Western societies, it's very heteronormative, but we know in certain societies or other cultures, they have a more encompassing gender role. It's more of a spectrum. It's not as gender binary. And then majority of cultures agree that incest is a taboo. And then almost all cultures have a sense of religion or a way of spirituality. Most cultures have rituals and practices for health and healing, have a sense of mythology, have their own way of understanding marriage. All cultures have a way of communicating with each other or language. They have their own art, dance, music. They have their own cooking, games, jokes, sports, birth, and death. So these are all cultural universals. So these are basically just categories that are common across all cultures. It's just that the expressions are different. Another concept that we have to also look into when we talk about intercultural relations is ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is a kind of ethnic or cultural group egocentrism which involves a belief in the cultural superiority of one's own group. And usually you would have this type of belief or have this type of feeling when you are exposed to a different culture. Like for example, when you travel to another culture, you will be seeing a different way of living, and then there's that initial reaction na, oh my gosh, we do things better back in my country, or we do things better back in my place. So that is an ethnocentric sentiment. Now, ethnocentrism is not necessarily bad. Ethnocentrism is a natural tendency of humans because, of course, you have spent your growing years in your hometown, in your home country, and that has been what you considered normal. So when you are exposed to another culture, either they go here or you come to their culture and you are exposed to a different type of practice or a different type of language or a different type of value, you could feel a little bit uncomfortable and you don't necessarily have to immediately accept it. No? So everyone has ethnocentric tendencies. Now, when a person physically and mentally maladapts when placed in a new cultural environment, that's called culture shock. No? It's a psychological condition wherein you become very distressed. No, you become dysfunctional in terms of your activities of daily living because you cannot cope with the new society or the new culture that you are exposed to. And usually this is a common experience among those who migrate to a more strict country in order for them to work. You know, like for example, when you are a Filipino, you go to the Middle Eastern countries wherein it's more strict. There are more restrictions and limitations, and there are a lot of things that Filipino things or Filipino practices that they could not have access to or they could not practice. Like for example, Catholicism. Then that could cause a physical or mental maladaptation for them, and that is called culture shock. But we also have to understand that ethnocentrism can also manifest with people with the best intention, sometimes travel to a society to help its people, seeing them as uneducated or backward or essentially inferior. no, because of that great belief that you are of the best culture or came from the best society or the best government. And this is the story of how colonialism happened in the medieval times, no, and that's one form of a really bad case of ethnocentrism, cultural imperialism, or in the deliberate imposition of one's own cultural values on another culture happens. And this is one of the reasons why we have a backward view about gender identities in the Philippines. Historically speaking, way back in the pre-colonial times, the Filipinos used to cherish two-spirit individuals. When we say two-spirit individuals, these are people who embody both feminine and masculine identities. Usually we call them the babaylan. And the babaylan are usually revered very highly in our institutions. During the time of the pre-colonial periods, there were some things that they had access to, that they could officiate court decisions during that time, and they were thought to be very much blessed by the gods because they were given both feminine and masculine qualities. But because of colonialism, people were forced to get into heteronormative standards, of course, that comes with Christianity, and up until now, that is very much seen in our society. And when you really think about it, if colonialism didn't happen, then we wouldn't have this transphobic and homophobic society that we have now. So a lot of homophobia, LGBTQIA stigma really stems from colonialism historically. And then there's also a concept called Xenocentrism. It's the reverse of ethnocentrism. So Xenocentrism is a culturally based tendency to value other cultures more highly than one's own, which can materialize in a variety of different ways. For instance, you are coming from a low-income country and then you visit high-income countries, and then when you go back to your home country, you suddenly feel like, ay, ito lang ako, no? We're not very advanced in this society. You feel that you have low self-esteem because you are in a country that's better than you, no? So that's called xenocentrism, no? And this is something that some OFWs experience when they go back to the Philippines, and then when they go back to the Philippines, they get exposed to traffic again, they get exposed to the heat again, they get exposed to corruption again, and then they remember, oh, you know what, the culture where I've been to, they're very progressive, they're not like the Philippines, their culture is better than ours. So that's an example of xenocentrism. And xenocentrism is much harmful to the individual when the individual is in the other country. If they are there and they feel like the culture that they bring is not as good as the culture where they are, that can also pose a problem in terms of how they would interact with other people in that society. Now, as people who are coming from the social sciences and the humanities, and as people who would eventually want to become advocates, for the oppressed people in our society, we always have to look at a stance not of ethnocentrism. No, I say that it's a natural tendency, but it's a natural tendency that we must be self-aware of. And when we evaluate the culture of other people, we have to also understand that we shouldn't evaluate the ways and the means of persons based on our standards in our culture. So when we look at the value of a cultural group, when we look at the norms, the rituals, the material and the non-material culture of other cultures, we always have to remember that these should not be evaluated based on our standards in our culture, because definitely you will see changes, you will see differences, and you might even have the tendency to think that your norms, your values are better than them, and therefore we have to look at them with a sense of cultural relativism. We don't say that something is wrong or something is right based on our standards. We have to look at it from their standards. The goal of this is to promote understanding of cultural practices that are not typically part of one's own culture. And this is a large part of multiculturalism. You know, when you do practice cultural relativism, it promotes being able to get along with other cultures in a diverse society. Now, you may have heard of this term before, especially coming from Western societies, cultural diversity. So, cultural diversity is the cultural variety among people with different racial or ethnic backgrounds that is present in the world, societies, or organizations. In the Philippines, we do have quite a culturally diverse society. You know? So, we have a lot of ethnic groups. You know? We have, of course, the Lumads from Mindanao. We have the Bisaya and the Hiligaynon ethno-linguistic groups in Visayas and some parts of Mindanao. And then, of course, we have us, the Tagalogs, in the central and southern part of Mindanao. We have the Bicolanos from that part of the Luzon. And then, of course, we have the Cordillerans. But we do not have as much national diversity, no, international diversity, such as those that you can find in Canada or in the United States or in the European Union. Jonathan Sachs, you know, someone who is very much into multiculturalism, argues that just as the natural environment depends on biodiversity, so as the human environment, it depends on cultural diversity as well, because no one civilization encompasses all the spiritual, ethical, and artistic expressions of mankind. And you know, when you look at our practices and our norms and our beliefs here in the Philippines, a lot of what we do and what we have here in the Philippines is borrowed from other cultures. Now, for example, we Chinese, no, we have the pancit, and then we have our superstitious beliefs about grieving and funerals and death and other things. And yung suerte, yung feng shui and horoscopes, it come from the Chinese. Then, of course, we have the American way of doing education. You know, it's very much westernized, and of course the language I'm speaking now, it's very much borrowed from the Anglophone world, including the Americas, you know. And then, of course, in from the Spaniards, we were able to get the Christianity and conservatism, especially during their time in the earlier periods of colonialization. And then, of course, we have borrowed other things like from the India, right? So we also have curry in our food, and of course they're also integrated in our communities as well. So a lot of our practices in the Philippines, we can't really say that it's just ours. Just as you know, our own cultural practices, norms, and beliefs also get to penetrate in other societies as well. Like, for example, there are very influential Filipino communities in the States, in Europe, in Canada, in the Middle East, and you know, in some states in the United States, the second most common language is Filipino. So we also get to penetrate, and we also become a part of the cultural diversity that these other countries and societies have as well. One of the issues faced by countries with extensive cultural diversity is that there is a tendency for the dominant cultural group to control the extent to which minority communities get to express their cultural identities and practices, sometimes even coercing these groups to assimilate to a cultural identity which is similar to the dominant group in order to fit in. Before we get into this issue, let's talk about identity. Who are you? What's your social identity? What makes up who you are? And how did you have this type of personality, these norms, these values, these beliefs? And why are you different from those that you share a cultural background with? Like, why are you different from your parents? Why are you different from some of your friends? Why are you different from some of your classmates? Even if you interact frequently, and even if you are in the same group. Hofstede in 1994 argues that there are three components that influence our identity. First is our human nature. It's what separates us from other living beings. We are sentient and rational. Also, this is something that we inherit biologically from our parents. Genes determine the extent of hormones and neurotransmitters that basically shape our temperaments. Our physical bodies also determine our destinies in the future. This nature is what we share universally with other humans in this world. The next component of our identity is our cultural identity. This is how our social environment influences our beliefs and values. This is the way the norms of the society and groups that we belong in facilitate and restrict the way we think, feel, and behave. These are all the things we learn from our primary and secondary socialization and how we embody all of the things as we were socialized. And the last component of our identity is our personality, and this is where nature and nurture meet. This is our identity after we sift through all of the cultural messages and scripts that were given to us by our different groups of socialization: family, peers, school, government, etc. We navigate through these social influences to determine who we are, given our biological nature and genetic makeup. For example, biologically, cis men have larger skeletal and muscular frames compared to cis women counterparts. And maybe because of this, our social groups may compel a man to get into contact sports. But probably, he might also be exposed to peers who value creativity and art and are supportive of him getting into ballet dancing. Our individual stories and the characters and contexts and settings that happen throughout our lives, plus our genetic predispositions, all mixed together in order for us to have the unique personality that each of us have. And when we talk about the second layer of identity, which is culture, we all talk about the various ways that society categorizes its members through different stratification systems, such as these ones in this slide. So we have our nationality, our region or location, whether you're urban or rural. We have religion or also the lack of it. We also have political affiliations or the lack of it as well. We also have our soji. We have our generational cohorts, like if you're Generation Z, millennials like me, Generation X, and the boomers, and the greatest generation, which are older than the boomers. We also have our role categories. Like, for example, if you're a mother, that's a role category. There are social expectations that are expected of you when you are a mother. You're an ate, you're a kuya, you're a bunso, you're a father, you're a tita. So these are role categories that also bring in a lot of socialization scripts for us. Ethnicity, of course, our race, our ethno-linguistic group, our ability, and our socioeconomic status, our class. No? There's a different way we are being socialized when you're rich, when you're poor, when you're middle class. And of course, the organizations that we belong to, like DLSU as a way of socializing itself, private institutions, public institutions, Catholic institutions, etc., etc. Each type of membership brings in specific roles and scripts that we eventually ascribe to. Our memberships in these categories place us in unique social positions, whatever is the combination of each. Remember intersectionality and how experiences of privilege and oppression is different when you navigate around these different social locations? We are now living in a society wherein it's more complex. It's more differentiated. And the more complex and differentiated the social system is, the more potential groups and institutions there are in that society. And because each group of institution places individuals in different experiential worlds, and because culture derives in part from this experience, each of these groups and institutions can be a potential container for culture. And you would say, someone who is pursuing psychology would be different for someone who's pursuing political science, would be different from someone that's pursuing sociology, someone pursuing engineering, someone pursuing medicine. But we're just talking about the same people in the same generational cohort, in the same institution. But we understand that these, groupings, they could be possible containers for culture, and they could also be sharing a different social script that certain people have to prescribe themselves to or ascribe themselves to. And in every society and in every culture, there are subcultures. This is a cultural group within a larger culture, often having beliefs or interests at variance with those of the larger culture. sometimes the same, sometimes just having a different mode or demonstration. Like for example, we all consider ourselves Filipinos, but probably the subcultural set of the Visayas and the Hiligaynons and the Lumans, they identify as Filipino, but they are practices that are varied or different shaped from a general Filipino culture, as we would say, no? So, or probably generally we're all Filipinos, but the specific subset of a Filipino, millennial, urban poor may also have a different experience despite being a Filipino themselves. And in the modern world where we have complex societies, it is not very new for us to practice social categorization, which involves the most fundamentally a distinction between the group containing the self, the in-group, and the other groups, which are the outgroups, between the we's and the they's. So an in-group is a social group to which a person psychologically identifies as being a member of. Like for example, in my case, I identify as a nurse. And so nurses, I consider to be a part of their group. Or for example, I am a teacher, so the group of teacher or the faculty members in De La Salle University, I consider them my in-groups. No? I consider myself also a part of the LGBTQIA community. So these are my in-groups. Or probably for you, no, you might also have a group of friends and they're called your in-group. And then you also have people within your class that you don't really have a common interaction with, and they're not your in-groups, they're your out-groups. Or for example, you have within your people within your course, you consider them your in-groups, and the people from other courses or degrees in De La Salle University, you consider them as out-groups. Or probably you have a political affiliation and you are, for example, pro-government. So you might consider those who do not identify with your political affiliation as outgroups, which we obviously see now in social media nowadays. So that's in-group and out-group. The groups that you feel that you belong in group. The groups that you feel that you do not belong in, out-groups. And for each identity, there are groups within that specific identity that we feel like we belong in. Like for example, for nationality, my in-group is Filipino, my out-group is everybody else who are not Filipinos, right? Or for instance, socioeconomic status, no? I identify within the group of middle-class peoples. So richer individuals and poorer individuals, I consider them as outgroups. No? For example, ability. No, I am an able-bodied person. I have a few disabling conditions such as a compressed spine because of some accidents I've had. But generally, I consider myself a well person. So those who have visual and learning disabilities, they're the outgroups. No, at least in my experience. Now, specifically in the discussion of multiculturalism, the focus of the identities wherein we consider in-group and out-group relations as very volatile is the groupings on ethnicity and race. And when we, sometimes we consider you as out-group, but I don't necessarily have a bad relationship with you. But in the discussions on race and ethnicity, there are some people who are thought to be outgroups because of race or because of difference in ethnic groupings and are treated badly by those who do not identify with them. So let's get into first the difference between race and ethnicity. So race refers to the various attributes or competencies assigned to on the basis of biologically grounded features such as skin color. While ethnicity refers to a social group whose members share a distinct awareness of common cultural identity, differentiating them as a social group. So an example of a racial group is African Americans or Black Americans. And then for ethnicity, we have, for instance, the Latinx community or the Filipino-American community. So these are ethnicity. In the Philippines, we don't really have a very complex idea or complex segregation of society based on race, because we are dominated by a common racial background. Of course, that could be contestable by our historians and anthropologists, but the current understanding is that we have a common ancestry, and therefore race is not such a big issue. But we do have an issue on colorism. No, colorism is a specific type of segregation or outgrouping of othering of people because of the skin color that they have. And usually for colorism, we view fair-skinned people as better and as more acceptable in our society compared to dark-colored ones. So I am a I have been a victim of that, of bullying because of my skin color when I was younger, and until now I know that there are some people whose ambitions are shaped or have been affected because of their skin color, in the Philippines. And that's not just in the Philippines, but that's also shared in some other Southeast Asian countries, like for example Vietnam. So that's colorism. But more in the Philippines, it's really more of ethnic groups. And there are ethnic groups that we consider as dominant in our society, like the ones in Luzon, in NCR, or the one coming from urban communities. And we have ethnic groups that are less, that have lesser agency over their lives, like our indigenous peoples. So here are our examples, for race, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islanders, and white. That's in the Philippines. And then for ethnicity in the Philippines, these are our ethnic groups, Ivatan, Tagalog, Ilocano, Kamampangan, and usually these are ethno-linguistic, Zamboangueño, Boholano, Cuyonon, Eskaya, Hiligaynon, etc. And we have to remember that race is socially constructed. Ethnicity is socially constructed. Even in biological terms, there are no clear-cut races. Though there is a range of physical variation in human populations, human groups are on a continuum, and genetic diversity within population is as great as the diversity between them. Most sociologists argue that race is nothing more than ideological construct, and it's basically the meaning that we attach to skin color and to body type and to language and to cultural heritage that really determines the extent to which we behave towards our outgroups in terms of ethnicity and race. Now, in talking about intergroup relations in a society, there will be groups that are more dominant. They have more agency over their lives. They have more control over political and economic systems in that society. And we also have groups we consider minority groups. And this is any group of people who, because of their physical or cultural characteristics, are singled out from the others in the society in which they live for differential and unequal treatment, and who therefore regard themselves as object of collective discrimination. So these are the minority groups. Now, there are 5 criteria to say whether or not a certain group in a society is a minority group. So 1, there is a high rate of in-group marriage. Why is there high rate of in-group marriage? Because people from the out-group, especially the dominant culture, are not very much encouraged to marry them, right? Because they feel like they're marrying down if you are marrying someone from a minority group. They are aware that they are subordinate. They are aware that they are a minority. They are aware that they're being discriminated against. And then it's also the involuntary membership in the group that also increases them, that also makes them a minority group. They didn't choose to be born in a Latin family or in a Black family or in a family in an IT community. So it wasn't their choice. And there are also distinguishing physical or cultural traits like skin color or language that marks them as a member of that group. And that's why we have what we call in social media as culture vultures, wherein the people because they're able to mask their cultural identity. They're able to play along the different culture and play any race that they like, to their advantage. So that's called culture vulture. Because if the traits couldn't be hidden, there's less likely for you to um, to be a target of discrimination. And that's the reason why people are against blackface. Because blackface for people who are African American, this is not something that they can take off. No, this is something that marks them and makes them targets of discrimination. So you cannot just make these things as costumes for your Halloween party because it's fun. Because historically, this distinguishing physical trait has made them targets for discrimination. That's why it's offensive to do blackface or to come in as a minority culture in a Halloween party or whatever party, And of course, they're a minority group when there's unequal treatment and less power over their life. They don't have as much agency. They're targets of discrimination in that society, especially by the dominant groups in society. Okay, they have lesser access to healthcare, lower rates of employment in good jobs if ever they are employed. They have higher rates of abuse. They have higher rates of getting apprehended by the police. So these are some indicators of unequal treatment. And when a certain group in a society has these characteristics, they could be considered a minority group. And we also remember that number or the number in the population or the percentage of these people in the population does not count as criteria for discrimination or minority group. Like for example, in the Philippines, the Chinese community is fairly a smaller community compared to their non-Chinese Filipino counterparts. But they might have higher rates of in-group marriage, but they do not have an equal treatment and less power over their lives, if at all. Most of them occupy good positions in society in terms of class and politics. So despite their lower number in our society, they're not considered a minority group. So what makes you a minority group? Really, if you have more disadvantage in your lives compared to the dominant group. It's not about how many you are in a society. So the next concept that we'll be talking about are stereotypes. So stereotypes are oversimplified ideas about groups of people, overgeneralized images or ideas that has the potential to distort the essence of the individual. Stereotypes can be both negative or benevolent. Examples of stereotypes based on ethnic background would be that Ilocanos are frugal or kuripot, Filipinos are automatically good at singing, and Muslims are terrorists or naturally violent. For stereotypes based on SOGI, gay and other LGBTQIA people are sex hungry and easily get STIs, girls are too emotional, etc. The problem with stereotypes is that most of these generalizations cause negative image on the group and also take away the individuality of that member of that said group. Not all who identify to be a part of the group will necessarily exemplify all the traits that are determined by these stereotypes. Remember again that we have our own personality, our own set of a multitude of groups that we have belongingness to, and we have our own situations and life histories that shape who we are. The next concept we have is prejudice, and prejudice refers to usually unfavorable beliefs, thoughts, feelings, and attitudes that someone holds about a group that is not based on experience or facts. For example, prejudice that is related to a certain group of people based on race or ethnicity is called racism. Sometimes prejudice and stereotypes are terms that are used interchangeably. While they're similar, there are also differences in their meaning. So the intent of having stereotypes is to reduce our mental energy expenditure when we try to relate someone from an outgroup. This is because forming groups and assigning similar characteristics to groups make it easier for us to know and understand those people. But again, the issue here is that it limits the extent to which we can understand an individual just because that individual is a part of a given group. And as explained earlier, stereotypes do not have to be necessarily negative. Sometimes stereotypes could be positive. Like for example, Filipinos are naturally talented, but in fact, not every one of us are, inherently talented. Or negative, just like Muslims have negative or violent tendencies, which again is not true for that group of people. So it prevents us from really knowing a person wholly just because we already are attaching traits to that person based on group membership. But the difference between stereotypes and prejudice really is that prejudice speaks to us and are part of negative attitudes. So it is prejudice has more malice against a group of people. It usually is negative in nature, and basically we view people who are members of a certain cultural, ethnic, or social group as bad, negative, unfavorable. Just as we said that having stereotypes is a normal social response because it's something that we have because we are naturally ethnocentric. Prejudice, though, is something that has a negative connotation and has a malice to it towards the outgroup. So, for example, if you feel uncomfortable being with a person who wears a hijab or is identifiably Muslim, then that is a prejudice. The prejudice could cause negative stereotypes, but that malice, that malicious feeling that you have, or the negative feeling that you have, probably the hate that you feel when you are with someone or when you're exposed to different or other cultural groups or a specific cultural group is a form of prejudice. The next term we're going to talk about is stigma, and usually stigma is the idea that we attach to a person or a group of people that we have prejudice against. So a stigma is an attitude, behavior, or reputation, usually because of a membership in a cultural, ethnic, or other forms of social groups, which is socially discrediting in a particular way. It causes an individual to be mentally classified by others as undesirable. And the sociologist who has worked very profusely on stigma is Goffman. And usually Goffman explains that when it becomes more apparent due to physical or cultural markers that you are a member of a certain social group, or you have visibly a problematic behavior or an undesirable behavior, like for example an illness or a disease, then you are more likely to become a target of prejudicial feelings, attitudes, and behavior. And when prejudice takes form into individual actions or institutional actions, that prejudice is now called discrimination. So when it goes beyond our beliefs and attitudes and it becomes actions, behaviors, and norms in society, that is discrimination. So discrimination is an action or practice that excludes, disadvantages, or merely differentiates between individuals or groups on the basis of some ascribed or perceived trait or membership in a certain social group. Now we can further categorize stigma to felt stigma or internalized stigma. We have anticipated stigma and we have externalized stigma. So felt stigma or internalized stigma is the person who is a member of the disadvantaged group who has already internalized the negative narratives that other people or dominant groups have for that person. And one example of a specific form of internalized stigma that you might know of is internalized homophobia, wherein those people who identify to be gay or members of the LGBTQIA community would internalize, or would have lesser self-esteem and would view themselves negatively because they have already inculcated the negative narratives that society has for them. So it's internalized stigma. There's also internalized sexism, wherein the stereotypes and the prejudice that the people have against females, women also embodied it, and sometimes because of this internalized femophobia or sexism, they also become spreaders of that social script or the narratives. They contribute to it because of the stigma. And again, of course, there's the people of the disadvantaged group are not to be blamed for that, because if you are born in a society, like for example you are a member of an IP community, or you are a from a provincial group, and for example you are Bisaya, and the media has always been portraying you as someone who is a laughing stock, who does not know better than someone who comes from an urban area, then sometimes you get to internalize that and you start believing it in your own, and you start modifying your actions and your beliefs around that belief of the society, and it affects you. So that's internalized stigma. We also have anticipated stigma. So anticipated stigma is the extent to which a person kind of predicts that someone is going to be discriminating them because of their membership. So sometimes this is the reason why people wouldn't want to place labels on themselves, because they anticipate that once they have placed that label or that sign of undesirability in society, will invite discrimination to them. So for example, this is the reason why people don't easily come out as LGBTQIA, because they anticipate that when they do come out, when they attach that label to themselves, then they would have the discrimination. Another would be that they don't want to get tested for HIV because they know that when they become HIV positive, when that idea is attached to them, that is going to invite a lot of discrimination to them. So anticipated stigma, already predicting the type of discrimination that you will be getting because of a certain label that you have not yet attached or you have not come out yet. And of course, we have externalized stigma, and basically this is just another term for discrimination, wherein the stigma has already been more observable, apparent, and tangible through individual actions and also institutional actions. And then discrimination can be further categorized to individualized discrimination, where it is the individual who presses upon discrimination on an individual who is a member of a disadvantaged group. So examples for this would be you have your hate crime, you have your catcalling, you have your slurs, racial slurs. So these are examples of individualized discrimination. Next, we have structural or institutional discrimination, where instead of an individual, the discrimination is exemplified through institutional policies or programs or systems or organized way of life. An example of structural or institutional discrimination is, for example, not hiring people because of their age, sex, gender, class, or membership in a social group. So that's an example of institutional discrimination. Or for instance, giving more punishment to people who have committed crimes based on their cultural background. So these are examples of structural or institutional discrimination. And then we have discursive discrimination, which is a type of discrimination that is not really apparent, but it is something that's usually taken for granted, but is also equally as effective. So for example of discursive discrimination is, for instance, when you see a poster of a movie, and then you have a set of white actors. Usually, the actors that are usually slated in front of or centered in that poster are the white actors. And usually, even if the Asian or non-white actors have a really big contribution to the story, they usually would be placed somewhere in the back, or they will be of lower frame in the poster. So an example of discursive discrimination, it's not in your face, but it it puts the discrimination in a more unconscious level, so in a more taken for granted fashion. Usually, in a society that's culturally diverse, or there are more cultural groups in a given society, usually the dominant culture gets to decide how to be able to react to the presence of minority groups in their society. And in history, we have seen how dominant groups have responded to intergroup relations. And, there's a set of responses that are related to intergroup hostility. And we discuss the worst, and then we go to the best way of responding. So the worst way of intergroup relations is genocide. Genocide, which is the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially those of a particular ethnic group of nation. And of course, we've seen this through the Holocaust, the Nanking, the Ukrainian genocide, the Bosnian genocide, and we also see still, reports of genocidal acts happening in other parts of the world. Because again, when we talk about the scapegoat theory, we usually think that immigrants or minority groups are the reasons why there are many bad things happening to the dominant group. And, the worst way to deal with that is to kill or erase the minority group. Next, we have expulsion. It is when a subordinate group is being forced by a dominant group to leave a certain area or country. And this is something that we do to our Lumad peoples in the Mindanao because of mining issues. And also, this is also what we do for IPs when we have developmental projects such as dam building, mine building, etc., etc. So that's an example of expulsion. Next, we have segregation. Segregation wherein there's physical separation of two groups, particularly in residence, workplace, and social function. So we see this very clearly in the Jim Crow laws in the early 1900s of the United States, wherein they have a different CR for the blacks in America compared with the whites. They have a different hospital, a different school, and usually mas underfunded and mas less valued the residences in black communities and black schools and black hospitals compared to their white counterparts. So they're living together, they're existing together, but the access to essential resources are different, and the values that are attached to those resources are also unequal. But of course, there are also positive ways of doing intergroup relations. Some are considered to be better than others, but at least we come from a place that we do not have bad intentions or bad connotations with the minority groups. And these are the three. We have pluralism. So pluralism is a mixture of different cultures where each culture retains its own identity and yet adds to the flavor of the whole. So pluralism is also what we call a salad bowl of cultures. You can still taste every single ingredient that you put in the salad, but the taste of each ingredient put together adds to the overall taste of the salad as a whole. So that's what pluralism is. And this is something that is practiced in societies like Canada and of course like New York, for instance, and California, wherein there's a larger concentration of multiracial cultural backgrounds. And then we have assimilation, wherein a minority individual or group gives up its own identity by taking on the characteristics of the dominant culture. And we've seen how, for example, Filipino communities in the United States have Americanized themselves in order for them to fit in. And of course, compared to pluralism, assimilation still invokes the power of the dominant culture. They press upon the minority culture, but at least the dominant culture is not negatively treating those who are from a non-dominant culture. But of course, you still have to subsume under the dominant culture. So, in my opinion, pluralism is much better than assimilation. And then finally, we have amalgamation, the process by which a minority group and a majority group combine to form a new group. And if the pluralism is the salad bowl, the amalgamation is the melting pot. So they all give up their own cultural identities and they build their a unifying cultural identity. While amalgamation sounds better than assimilation, my opinion would be that pluralism would be better. And pluralism is where multiculturalism is usually connected to. Because amalgamation, the tendency is people still have to give up their identities in order to have a harmonious living with each other. But in pluralism, you don't necessarily have to give up your cultural identity. You just provided a space, you just provided a liberty to practice your own cultural identity and interact with other cultures while maintaining your cultural identity. In amalgamation, you all have to share a common cultural identity. Yun. So you may also have learned of the term acculturation, which is the process of social, psychological, and cultural change that stems from the balancing of the cultures while adapting to the prevailing culture of the society, process in which an individual adapts, acquires, and adjusts to a new cultural environment. So usually if you are from an outside culture and you reside in a dominant culture that you do not identify with, this is the process wherein you try to learn and you change in order to adapt to the current dominant culture. And this is usually what we see as the earlier parts of trying to assimilate into a dominant culture. So while acculturation comes from the efforts of the minority group, accommodation comes from the efforts of the dominant group. So the accommodation is the dominant group allows for the minority groups to express their culture, which is again the opposite of assimilation. So we just if I am an American, no, I allow my neighbors who are LGBTQIA to raise their flags up. I allow and I respect the food practices and the prayer practices of my Muslim brothers and sisters. So that's accommodation. It is an effort that comes from the dominant group. And now that brings us to the larger concept of multiculturalism, which is the second concept or the second phenomenon that we study in this subject, multiculturalism. And as I explained earlier, multiculturalism relates more to pluralism. It relates more to accommodation rather than assimilation or amalgamation. Longley argues that different cultures can coexist peacefully. Multiculturalism expresses the view that society is enriched by preserving, respecting, and even encouraging cultural diversity. Now, in societies wherein cultural diversity can be seen, like for example, those that we see in the West, there seems to be a very polarizing discussion on whether, the dominant group should be the one to dictate most of the policies, and the ones in the minority groups just have to assimilate to these policies, or should we allow for really specific cultural nuances to still exist and still be respected or allowed in the dominant group? Because it's really more of, should we really allow cultural practices even if they are not aligned with dominant group? because sometimes the dominant group, if we allow you to have this kind of food, if we allow you to have this prayer time during work, or if we allow you to be Muslims in a Catholic school or in a Catholic institution, or if I allow you to be black while being in a white community, this seems to be a big abala for them, a big inconvenience to them, and that inconvenience rates from, just simple nuance to, just full-blown hate. And for countries like this, this is the very polarizing decision that, is still something that is being talked about, being argued about, debated about. And we don't really have to look far. We just look at the United States and how people are very much polarized with the way they should treat, immigrants in their society, how they treat, non-Christians in their society, how they treat other races other than white in their society. So. But again, multiculturalism believes that, society will benefit if we allow them to exist, if we allow them to express their cultural uniqueness, if we allow our society to be a salad bowl instead of a melting pot, or instead of forcing these minority groups to assimilate, society will benefit more. Because going back to our earlier assertions in this lecture, just like biodiversity is important in the living world, in the biological ecosystem, in the human ecosystem, cultural identities and cultural expressions and diversity is also something that's positive, because different cultures gives us many windows to see the world and many windows to appreciate existence. Multiculturalism offers us resources that can change the way we see and act in the world. We get to be exposed to the beliefs. And I think this is something that we also appreciate in the Philippines, from where we are, when we started to get more access to the internet and we start getting exposed to different Western and Asian cultures, just like Korea, the United States, Europe. We also get to have, a more understanding about the world, a more progressive stance towards topics and issues. Exposure to the beliefs, values, practices of other countries not only expands and enriches our knowledge of the human condition, it also offers us fresh perspective from which to question and possibly revise our own established cultural practices and preconceptions. And this is not to say that that all cultures are inherently good. Of course, we have to take cultural relativism with a grain of salt. Like, for example, we cannot just say, "Oh, I respect female genital mutilation because it's something that is spiritually connected to certain African tribes." But it's something that violates the sanctity of the human body and the femininity of women. I cannot just say that it's okay to just accept the rapey culture of some gay subcultures just because we respect their being gays. But there are limits to this, of course. When the practices are harmful, then of course that's the time that the state should put its foot down in order to not hurt other groups of people. But it means that it also offers cultures a sort of self-awareness, and to be able to see what aspects of our culture could be improved, it could be made better when we allow ourselves to be exposed by other cultures. Now, in the next discussions on multiculturalism, in the latter weeks of this term, we'll be talking about the different perspectives of how we can approach multiculturalism policies in our communities and in our societies.